Please. I join with what Brian said in regard to helping to take care of children. Obviously, if anyone knows anything about taking care of kids, it would be he and his wife. In regard to their wonderful 9 children, I'll never forget being gone to Free Hardeman some years ago. Cheryl, I think you must have had some surgery, and Bonnie and Brian was with you. And I called Bonnie on the phone on Wednesday evening. It was probably close to 7 o'clock, and she said, "Guess what?" I said, "What?" She said, "I have all 9 of the Jacob kids with me, and we're headed to church." And I was doing the head count, and I said, "Hold on, our van doesn't hold 9. I said, how do you have 9? She said, "John Michael's driving." I said, "Oh, man." So I stopped and said a prayer. They got there safely and back, but she was exceedingly joyous that she had, including our 2, the 11 kids, that day, and they all survived to tell about it. So anyway, certainly we can do the same today, and we do appreciate Chris and family and Doug and Renee and so many others, and it won't hurt any of us to jump in and do what we can do, not just with these families, but anybody from time to time that will be helpful to each other. The text that was just read from Psalm 127 is one that we typically have looked at, and typically we said, and anybody that writes on this subject from a religious point of view talk about the fact that obviously children are like that of eras, and they're, to be shot out, they're to be sent out from parents in a good and godly way. And we, I think, have sort of followed that model, particularly here in our country. We, as we will say in just a moment, sort of look at it as a time of parenthood in which we train our children and try to bring them up in God's way, and then we want them to go forth. And certainly there's a lot to be said about that responsibility. And I think we need to be sure that we understand that first and foremost, it's not the church's job, and it's not the government's job, and it's not the school's job to take care of kids. First and foremost, it's the parent's job. It all starts in the home. And that's something, unfortunately and tragically, in our world today that so many individuals do not understand. In fact, they expect others to take care of their primary situation. And tragically today, teachers, whether public or private, understand and see that degradation of lack of respect, lack of learning, lack of motivation, lack of whatever else you want to say, simply because mom and dad have shirked their duty of not being who they need to be, particularly the godly examples that they need to be. And so therefore, much has been said throughout parenting issues and magazines and commentaries and other kind of things. Okay, parents, you do your job, you prepare them well, and then you let them leave, because after all, that's what you're supposed to be doing. But I've got a question to ask this morning. Have we allowed this culture of ours, particularly here in our country, to influence us in that regard? Because it's natural in our country for us to raise our children. We want them to mature. We want them to excel. We want them to learn all the valuable lessons that they can learn from home, from being in school, whether it's public or private or homeschool. We want them to learn all the things that they need to learn. We want them to graduate. And then we want to say, go forth. We want them to lead. We want them to be on their own. And sometimes it may be because of extenuating circumstances or because they decide to stay at home or other such things and go to school, that they do stay longer in a home environment. But the point of the matter is we want them to grow up. We want them to become outstanding young adults and young citizens, both of our country and particularly of the Lord's church. And yes, let's all admit it, the empty nest is something that parents and I guess children somewhat respectfully understand that is the goal in mind. Now, if your situation has been different, then you don't. I guess this lesson's not for you. But I want us to look at Psalm 127 and the implications of that as it applies to this situation. And the first thing we need to understand is that everything that we've just said was totally opposite of the way it was in the Old Testament. Because if you look at the pattern of parenthood, if you look at the relationship of parents, husbands and wives with each other, particularly with their children, particularly in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament age, you will find this to be totally different than the culture that I've just mentioned a few moments ago. Here's what was expected of them. Sons were to become hardworking adults. They were to marry. They were to have children. Women were to marry. They'd have children, work hard in the home. That was just what was expected of them within that culture, within that environment. But now here's where it gets different. Those adult children were encouraged. In fact, I'll go ahead and say were expected to stay close by to the home environment. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And we'll look at a biblical one, or at least a couple in just a moment. But that was the status quo. Yes, the children were excel. Yes, the children would grow up. Yes, the children would graduate, I guess you can call it, from whatever learning facility that they would have had there, particularly in the Old Testament, under the scribes of the day or the teachers of the law of that day. We know that Jesus in the city of Nazareth went to school. There was a learning teacher, a person that I guess he would have been the first youth minister of the day that would have taught these children about lessons of not only the Hebrew, but also conduct and respect and other such things. But these adult children would see as one of their responsibilities, yes, I'm providing for myself. Yes, I have a wife. Yes, I have children. But also, they would see it as a direct relationship to their success or failure as to how and what kind of relationship they had with the adults that were older than them around that home environment. Now, I said that parenting was different in ancient Israel. Here's why. The commandments of God for his people. Remember, God said continually in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, you are a select group of people. You weren't the best and you weren't the most and you weren't the most prominent, but I chose you to be my people. And because God chose them to be his people, he also had commandments for them that he wanted them to model and for them to obey and adhere to. And part of that was this cohesiveness that they were going to have in the home and family environment. Do yourself a favor sometime and read from Joshua chapter 13 to Joshua 21, where Joshua begins to divide through inspiration of God the land out to all the different tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's no mistake at all that this land was given to them by family, through family. Thus meaning that proximity was very important. Location was very important. Staying close by was very important. Why? Because your inheritance in this promised land is given to you by a family, through a family connection. It wasn't individuals, and it wasn't, okay, I think I'll take this parcel of land and I'll bid for this parcel. It wasn't that at all. Joshua was saying, this is the promised land that God's promised you, and here's the way you're going to receive it. Here's the only way you're going to receive it. Tribe, family, smaller family. I mean, that's the way it all worked. Think about it. Remember Leviticus chapter 25? If someone through default, if someone through hard luck, if someone through not being able to had something terrible happen to them that they had to sell their land for a period of time, family members, it was commanded them, you pick up the slack, you go to them, you go back and you buy that land so that it can stay in the family unit. That was just a commandment of God. Thus, again, avoiding having different people from other places, particularly non-Jews, to ever be able to have that land and to be amongst those individuals. Remember Deuteronomy chapter 25, among other places. There's a man that's got several sons, and the oldest one marries, and they die. What's the responsibility of the next oldest child, son? You go marry that widow. You have the relations that will produce a child so that that name of that firstborn child can be continued on. Again, you're saying, well, what's that have to do with responsibility? It has everything to do with responsibility. Because that's the way that God wanted and expected and commanded those family members to be able to live and to thrive. You do so within a family unit. Now, think about it. If you were to talk to people today outside of our country, in many places in our world today, they still operate in the very same way that they did back in the Old Testament. Families live together. Tribal relationships, family units are close and very well connected. And it's that reason, it's that for a reason. And it has to do not only in regard to perhaps financial concerns, but I think there's a lot more to it than just that. You think of some of the cultures, the Chinese culture among many others that we can mention, whereas the hierarchy of that family unit is all based on close proximity and relationships that are strong or that are thriving within that unit of the younger ones eventually being able to help and take care of the older ones in that regard. And you think about our culture today. Just imagine we tell folks, well, you know, you're not doing it right. You need to raise your kids and then let them go so that they can go start their own family. And they'd look at you and say what? That's not the way it is. And so today I'm afraid in some respects, and don't get overwrought here in regard to thinking, don't get ahead of me, I guess I should say, in regard to thinking, oh, Ron's just lost it today in regard to because, you know, I've done this in our family, as likely in your family, we've all done the same thing. We got our kids to graduate and whatever, and then move and get on about them business because we want them to thrive in individual relationships. Well, what do we gain from the Word of God? What's the context of Psalm 127 have to do with all this? First of all, the context is, and the message is, if you fear God, if you tremendously allow God to be the builder of your home, as He is the city, as He is the nation, you'll be blessed. Within the context of the passage, that's the point that the psalmist here is making. And then particularly he's saying, you've got to trust in God. Not in me, not in you. And if you think about it today, that's so counter to what our world, particularly in our country, believes. I'm my own boss. It's me, myself, and I. I take care of myself. I can do everything. Everything that I have belongs to me. It's through my ability and my efforts that I've gained all the things that I've gained. And it's this me kind of world in which we live today. And that's the way they live, and that's the lessons that they teach their children. And thus the children become exactly like their parents or their grandparents or others around them, and they become selfish also as well. In Psalm 127, there in the passage where it says, unless the Lord builds the house, a labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. Notice the phrase there, vanity. You know, if you don't trust in the Lord, and if you don't allow God to have the foremost relationship that you have in your home, then it doesn't matter how much you watch. It doesn't matter how much you care. It doesn't matter how much you do for your children. It's all going to be in vain. It's vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so He gives His beloved sleep. Behold, verse 3, children are a heritage from the Lord. The word there in the original Hebrew can be translated children in other passages, but most scholars believe that the better translation for this particular context are sons. Now here's why. He's saying that these sons are given to the father, obviously through his wife, but they come from the Lord. Notice that phrase there in verse 3. Children are a heritage from the Lord. Well, let's insert sons are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is His reward. And then the phrase, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the sons of one's youth. And notice the context. And then it says, verse 5, that the end result is this man, this father, the patriarch of the home, he's not going to be in any kind of distress when he stands before the enemies in the gate. That's exactly what verse 5 says. Now notice what this means. In that day, sons provided security. Like the idea of a weapon, the idea of an arrow in the quiver of one that's ready to fight or defend. That's what sons are for. Some of you know, and I certainly know, of family members, and we're talking about some years ago. But one of the reasons why parents had so many children is because they needed children to operate the farm. And obviously the more sons you had in regard to their ability out in the field versus in the work that the women did inside the house, I mean, that was the whole reason behind that, among other things. And I've talked, and you've talked to people, and maybe you came from a family unit in which that was the case, that those were a blessing to them. And that's the whole point that he's saying here. In this particular situation, When you meet the enemy at the gate, it's good to have those sons there. It's good to have that kind of relationship there. And the point that he's making is, if you don't have that, particularly because of your relationship and your trust and your love for the Lord, it's useless. Well, how do you apply that today? Well, first of all, I don't think we have to say, okay, you're not moving away from home, because probably most of us want, for many kinds of reasons, our children to move if they so need to do so. But we sure would like to have them close by, wouldn't we? But I think there's the application of this in regard to responsibility. I don't know, I didn't count, but there are several of us in this audience today that are going through the period in our lives and the period in our parents' lives of trying to figure out and trying to do the very best thing that we can possibly do for them out of love and respect for them and who they are and what they mean to us. And it's a challenge. And some of you in this audience know exactly what I'm talking about. And it's a continual thing. And yes, and it's not done out of duty, and it's not done out of grumbling or complaining. It ought to be done out of just the opposite: gratitude, love, and respect. And that's exactly the issue of the first century world that Jesus came into. And unfortunately, there were those in the first century world that were not handling it correctly. Matthew 15, Mark chapter 7 were two of those instances in which Jesus said, you've taken the laws of God and you've added to and taken away from those laws to the point that you've added this sort of extending situation. Okay, if you just promise all your money to the God, and I really wonder how they did that, and I really wonder if they just did it in name only and they never actually gave their money to God. But if you label the money, the extra money that you used to taking care of your parents, and you just label it to the Lord, then you're not responsible for them. And Jesus says, in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrine the commandments of men. That's exactly what Matthew 15 verse 9 says. And in Mark chapter 7, the same thing. You've taken the law of God and you've showed no total disrespect for, number one, God, but you've also showed total disrespect for your parents that brought you into this world. Now, as we study 1 Timothy next week in our Bible study together, God provided for widows that do not have family members that would or can take care of them. But the responsibility, first and foremost, for Joe and Dot Williams was not the church at Northport, Alabama, and is not the church at Amory, Mississippi. It's Cindy Hathcock and Ron and Don Williams. There's where the responsibility starts. And yes, it may be helpful to have other individuals, but first and foremost, they're our responsibility. They're our people to take care of. Because as Paul would say in 1 Timothy chapter 5, in the context of dealing with those widows, he who does not take care of his own family is worse than a pagan. It's worse than a reprobate. And it was true there in the first century world, and it's true today in the 21st century world. And it's sad sometimes to see the terrible things that are done supposedly in taking care of mom or dad in regard to the lack of respect and love and what is best for them in those regards. Some of you that are older know this challenge. You know the questions. You understand, and you may, and I'm not trying to get into your business or the business of your children, and no one came and told me to say any of this. They didn't know I was going to preach this lesson. That we all need to be civil, and we all need to work together, and we all need maybe to sometimes compromise one thing or the other for the safety of everyone concerned. But the first and foremost is that's our responsibility. That's my responsibility. It's your responsibility if you have parents that are aging and that need your help in one way or the other. I think the next thing we've got to be sure is we don't let culture dictate what we need to do to take care of those that we love. And we may not just be talking about parents. We may be talking about grandparents. We may be talking about aunts or uncles or other situations. And some of you, again, know well what I'm talking about because you've had those relationships that you've taken care of and tried to take care of people. And it sometimes it's not pleasant. And sometimes it's hard and it's difficult. But yet we got to be sure that we don't just try to make everything fit the way the culture around us suggests. Most of all, we need to remember, and I guess I'm preaching to myself along with others our age. Remember this. You can work every single day. You can put in every hour possible and make as much money as you possibly can do, and in doing so, you may mess up your entire family. You may be sacrificing the one thing that should never be sacrificed. Because I think that's exactly the point that the psalmist here is making. Unless the Lord builds the house. And the only way the Lord's going to build the house today in our world is we allow Him to build it. We allow Him to be the center of everything that we say and everything that we do. And that includes care for family. Here's his point. You fear Him, and God will bless. At the end of the day, I want to be a Christian, and I know that you want to as well. And part of that involves the way that I take care of my children and bring them up in God's way, and the way I take care of others around me, my parents and others. And the same is true here. And sometimes within the context of no family, then we as the church have to step in, need to step in, be there for them to help in whatever way possible, or to at least complement the work that children are doing in helping with others. How many times have we throughout these years stepped in, someone sick, someone hurting, someone at death because of death, and tried to be there for them? I know we can't do as much as maybe the families can do, but we all need to do our part. Perhaps this has helped all of us to relook at this particular psalm among others. But the most important thing is the Lord's got to be at the center of the house and the home. And that means He needs to be the Savior of your life. If you're not a New Testament Christian today, you know you need to become one, or you need to come back and start again with this church. We invite you to come and